Good afternoon, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be with you in this beautiful space. Thank you so much for coming out for what is going to be a transformative and wonderful afternoon. My name is Anna Marley. I am the Director of Curatorial Affairs here at the Toledo Museum of Art. I have lived in this beautiful city for a month and a half now. It is an honor for me to be here in this capacity to introduce Ocean Vuong, as well as Dr. Joey Kim. So I'm going to do an introduction, and then we will get the program started. So firstly, I would like to thank the University of Toledo's Department of English Language and Literature for their sponsorship of today's event. Let's give our friends applause. I am so unbelievably thrilled that we are here today celebrating oceans photography being shown for the first time in a museum. Congratulations, Ocean. So all of you here today, as well as those of you joining us online via Zoom, please come visit us in person here at the museum if you can before June 29th, 2025 to view the works in person. They are on view very close to us in a beautiful exhibition called From Asia to the World, Ancient to Contemporary Art, curated by our own curator of Asian art, Dr. Christine Starkman. And I would like to thank her for working on initiating this event, as well as curating the beautiful exhibition that you will all be able to see. I also would like to say that our gift shop has Ocean's books in and available for purchase. We will be doing a book signing after this event. So if you didn't bring your own book, which I was happy to see a lot of you have, you can go purchase one before the book signing. I would like to acknowledge that the Toledo Museum of Art is located on the ancestral homelands of the Erie, Kickapoo, Odawa, and Seneca. We recognize that many other Native tribes have also conducted trade on and called this region their home, including the Lenape, who were originally in the Philadelphia area, which is where I moved from a month and a half ago, the Miami, the Ojibwe, Peoria, Potawatomi, Sauk, Shawnee, and the Wyandot. We at the museum acknowledge and honor the past, present, and future lives of the indigenous peoples in the Toledo area and thank them for their resilience as stewards of the land on which this museum now resides. I would like to invite all of you who are here today to come back on October 16th for our Indigenous Peoples Day celebration here at the museum. We'll have art activities and performances, and you can learn about our programs on our website, toledomuseum.org events. Following today's conversation in here, there will be a book signing in Libby Court, and the space is limited to those who have already registered. So if you're on Zoom, don't run into the museum. Just stay home where it's nice and warm. We have live captioning available today. You will see it available in the Zoom. Captions will appear on the screen. There is also a QR code here. You can scan it and follow along on your phone if you need extra captions. So now I'm going to introduce our two speakers. Dr. Joey S. Kim is assistant professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Toledo. Prior to arriving at Toledo, Dr. Kim was a postdoctoral fellow at Boston University's Killichand Honors College and held teaching positions at The Ohio State University and the University of Texas at Austin. She researches global Anglophone literature with a focus on 19th century poetics, global Asian cultures, Asian American literature, and critical race and ethnic studies. And after reading about Joey, I would like to be in a book club with her because all of this aligns with things that interest me very much. Recently recognized as a 20 under 40 Toledo awardee, she is active in the community, working with the Arts Commission of Greater Toledo, the Fair Housing Center, the Toledo-Lucas County Public Library, and local news outlets to amplify literature, the arts, and Asian American representation in the region. Our esteemed guest of honor, Ocean Vuong, is the author of the novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, winner of an American Book Award, a PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction, and the Center for Fiction's first novel prize. The novel spent 6 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and has since sold more than 1 million copies in 40 languages. We are here not only to celebrate Ocean's writing, but his role as a photographer. Please enjoy seeing his photography, as I mentioned, for the first time on view in a museum in the galleries after the talk. Born in Saigon, Vietnam, and raised in Hartford, Connecticut, in a working-class family of nail salon and factory laborers, Vuong was educated at Manchester Community College and Pace University before enrolling at Brooklyn College, where he graduated with a BA in 19th century American literature. He received his MFA in poetry from NYU University. And so today we are going to be talking about Ocean's photography, life, and literature, and I am thrilled that Dr. Joey Kim will be in conversation with Ocean. Let's please welcome our two wonderful speakers.
Thank you so much, Anna. So this is going to be a great, we're going to start with Ocean actually sharing some of his journey toward photography and some of the recent work that he's been doing. Then we're going to have a 45-minute conversation, and then we're going to end with some pre-selected questions from the audience. So without further ado, I turn it over to you, Ocean.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's such a deep honor that this is the occasion for my first time in Toledo, and certainly not my last. It's been such a warm welcome, such a beautiful city. I've learned more about glass than I could and there's more to know, and I'm now a glass enthusiast. I'm going to be spitting glass facts for years after this. Before I begin this brief presentation on my photos, most of you know me as a writer, so I think it'll be interesting to give you background on this secret art that I've been doing since I was about 17 years old. I just want to thank the Toledo Museum, the curators, Anna Marley, and the staff. You know, you must know it's incredibly rare for an ungalleried first-time artist like myself to have an exhibition in this way. But it's the bedrock of curatorial work to take chances. You know, one of my heroes, John Sokowski, of course, the former photography curator at the MoMA, used to, the lore was that you can drop off a box of photos at the moment. He would look at it. If he liked it, you get an appointment. Before you know it, you'll be inside the museum. It's how Eggleston, et cetera, and hundreds of photographers found their way. And a lot of that has gone away. So it's been such a surprise that when the Toledo Museum asked me to collaborate on a book nook, I said, well, I actually, since you're a museum, I'm working on starting to share my photography. And they got together and they made this decision on their own, and we're here today, and we have these prints because of the courage, the innovation, and the daringness, dare I say, of these curators. And it's such a great honor for me to say that the Toledo Museum is the first ever place my photos will be on print forever and ever, and I'm really, really proud to say that. So thank you to your community and to the museum. So I'll dive quickly. There's 34 images, but we'll go through them quite quickly, and then we'll have a conversation. So this little fella here, it's a self-portrait of myself when I was 18 years old on my 18th birthday, taken by a friend's borrowed Nikon. And I initially started taking photographs because my mother's illiterate. And when I first showed her a published poem published around this time, in my triumphant giddiness, I ran to her nail salon and said, "Ma, look, I didn't waste my life. I'm in print, I'm in print." And as soon as I handed her the journal, her face fell, and my face, I said, "I forgot she can't read." And so it was suddenly, this moment of triumph suddenly became a moment of grief. And so I borrowed my friend's Nikon from the weeks after and started taking photographs of our life in New England and taking photos of her. And one day when I shared her a stack of prints, she looked through it and she said, what I didn't expect as an 18-year-old, she said, "My goodness, son, I didn't know our life was so sad." And the word sad in Vietnamese is a bit more capacious than the English definition. It has a definition of fleeting beauty, right, of loss, right? So it's interesting, and she was kind of a precursor critic for the rest of my work. She got it right. So it's in a way quite serendipitous now that I look at this photo and I also say, gosh, it's quite sad. This, of course, is the first edition of my first book of poems. It comes from a photo that was taken while we were in a refugee camp in the Philippines in 1990. There was a photographer who was also a refugee in the camp, and for the price of one day's ration of rice, which was 3 cans, he would take portraits of families. And you can see it's a tin shack. There's people in the back. But what was stunning about this photo for me was that, you know, I have my mother on the left, my aunt on the right, and it was these women who forgoes the nourishment of their body to choose to preserve the image of our bodies on paper. And it's telling that my father was not here that day. He probably would not have allowed that. And so it was this women in my family, and my father would leave the family shortly after this, and I would be raised entirely by women. But I always draw my artistic intuition to this moment is because they curated the image of themselves, and they sacrificed sustenance to do so. It's such incredible. So when I began my career, I wanted to begin with living, smiling Vietnamese bodies, especially since the Vietnamese body in American culture has often been rendered as a corpse, often through film, media, war photography, etc., which leads me to the next slide. So this is a typical altar in a Vietnamese home. I'm interested in the Vietnamese vernacular use of photography. You can go to perhaps the most impoverished Vietnamese homes, and there will be no photography anywhere but the altar. And I'm interested in it because it has an alternative function than the Western use, often to celebrate family. Here, it's a utilitarian use in that the dead are put on the altar so that when they visit, they know it's their home. They can see themselves, say, I'm in the right place. The food put out for me is for me. I have permission to eat it. It's kind of this Confucian Buddhist belief. So I draw my work in photography to the center where it's built on the elegiac grief rituals. This photo, it's small, and it's probably good that it's small. When I was studying at a community college, I started to look at photo books to study the form, and that's where I found some of my heroes like Nan Goldin, Joel Sternfield, Gordon Parks, Carrie Mae Weems. And I was looking at this anthology by the International Center of Photography one day, and it was organized through genre, so, portraits, landscapes, and I came upon this one section called Still Lifes. And you see the quintessential still lifes, fruit, Roman facades, objet d'art. And then the next page, I saw something that struck me, and I thought, oh, this must be a shattered bust. And upon closer inspection, it was actually the face of a dead Vietnamese man taken by war photographer Don McCullen at this kind of close evidentiary range. And but that is a very quintessential moment for a Vietnamese American child who only sees themselves represented as a corpse, a la Apocalypse Now, John Wayne's The Green Berets, etc. So here it is again. But it's interesting to me that the racialized body is rendered an aesthetic impulse, right? And of course, my mind thinks, well, would this photo have been in this book at all if it was an American GI's corpse? Or certainly, would it have been in the still lifes section, right? So it brings to mind, again, the curatorial power of how bodies are rendered. It brings me to this next photo. It's a photo that I done myself. It's a performance. Do not fret, this is not a dead body. It is me who will one day be a dead body. But this is a charged moment for me. This is kind of, to me, if it makes any sense, the most American photo I've taken. And because both the wall, as we all know, and that body would not exist without the Vietnam War. I am a product of the war. My grandfather was an American vet of Irish descent who served 6 years in the army. And because of that, my genealogy is entangled in American history. And I have ancestors who go all the way back to veterans in the Revolutionary War who fought to found this country, and the Civil War, who fought to preserve this country, specifically in nearby Indiana regiments in the Cumberland campaigns. And so it's an open interpretation, but the question that I'm interested in is who gets to be memorialized and who gets to be left out of the state's memory, particularly the 3 million Vietnamese who died in the war, many of whose relatives would then become American citizens. And so we have this question of what is an American body? And of course, it's something only photography can do. I lay there all but 5 seconds, but the wall will remain, and it interferes with photography's leading line principles, painting single point subjectiveness, and becomes a kind of intervention into that idea. It brings up to mind also the war photography of Alexander Gardner and Matthew Brady during the Civil War, of course, whom repositioned and staged the bodies of Confederate and Federal soldiers to sensationalize the beginning of photography's impulse in American history. And so it's also an allusion. It's both an homage and a critique of how we remember as well. This is a photo of my brother by the river where we live. And this actually is a quintessential moment because that's a towel It happens to be his towel, but it's a beautiful moment because to me it becomes a kind of poetry, a symbol of who we are as Americans, the complications therein. So from here on out, I'll just go through the images quickly. I'm interested in my project going from the narrow confines of my family and moving towards my region, which is New England, a place I've called home, a place that is very dear to me. It's also the perfect place to learn and come to reckon with America. It's a place of great abolitionist triumphs, but also great loss and settler colonialism, indigenous genocide in the 1700s. And so it's a wonderful place, but it's also charged. It's also the place where Purdue Pharma began their campaign in Stamford, Connecticut, that then decimated the region way before politicians used it as a catchphrase, the opioid epidemic. We were losing gym teachers, neighbors, often with great shame that there were no wakes, no funerals, no gravestones to know them by. So I'll just go quickly. You can see that it starts with family and it'll move towards the community. It's my brother in 2009, and here he is 10 years later. He moves in with me shortly after our mother's passing, and that's the corner of that stuffed animal is her hair clip. All I know of war is win. This is the only photo of my mother laughing that I have. You know, coming from a working class family, you realize that the photo was so expensive, particularly in the 90s. Film was so expensive that all photographs were staged. We were always aware of the camera, and we stood and we gave our best version of ourselves. And I was very fortunate to catch my mother laughing. And it's also the last scene in my novel, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, is of the mother laughing. This is my brother holding my mother's urn. My photo of Nan Golden. So Nan is in, the reason why I'm here is because of Nan. She photographed me in 2021 for a magazine, and I was telling her this. I said, I'm a photographer too, but I'm kind of like a closeted one. And she just said, you have to share it. If you dedicate that long to any work, you have to put yourself out there. And it's no credit to my own work. I think it's just Nan's generosity and her beauty and her kindness. And I think she would have given that permission to anybody. But I took it seriously, and I have her to thank for this. And I'm really, really pleased to know her. And thank you, Nan Golden. This is the final picture in the project of my brother and I at the Mill River where we live, and I'll leave that up as we talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ocean.
Thank you.
Yeah, these photos are also telling us a story just by the way in which they're framed. And I, I just had to start, I guess, as a fan in many ways. When I first encountered your writing, I, I was really struck by the visceral nature, the images, the way in which the images populated your scenes and your stories. It seems then a really natural shift, but also really significant, this turn to photography. And I just wanted to know just how writing and photography, how as genres, as an interdisciplinary artist, how they fuse or inform each other, and what is the relationship between them for you?
Well, I think both photography and poetry function through occlusion, right? The world is blocked off. It's about what we don't say on the page. It's about that negative space. Keats called it negative capability. And I would argue that photography has that too, right? It's, in a way, it has this function that even film doesn't have, right? Because even film of still images, there's a reel. And so time becomes quite oppressive so that you're being pulled by it. And the film keeps completing itself. The person walks across the room. If this is a film, the flag flutters, the face. And so what happens is that the viewer becomes quite passive. They're waiting for something to happen. But photography, because it arrests time, it's all a provocation, similar to the poem. The poem is a provocation moving forward. It's particularly in the Eastern tradition with Basho, Li Bai, Du Fu. Those poets saw poetry as something that should beckon the viewer forward, and less so about telling you how to feel. And so I think both photography and poetry are so similar because they both signal mythology without narration. And so they're built on tension alone. And I see the camera kind of like a hole puncher. You're punching out parts of time, and at the end you have a collection of pieces of the past that have been displaced. And I read somewhere that one of my favorite photographers, Gary Winogrand, if you compile all of the stops, the shutter stops, in his entire archive, it only goes to 11 seconds, 11 and a half seconds, right? And how lucky we are to have such a technology that allows for that compression, that mythology. But what I love about it is that it's an invitation always to the viewer, whereas film and music there's a score, and it doesn't mean it's less than this art, but it doesn't have that same provocation. You look at a photograph, you say, I have time, and whatever I think is true. There's no wrong way to look at something, right? And I think the camera also is the technology of yes and affirmation. It can only say yes. And as a writer, as you know, writing is an art full of maybes, right? Full of, Sontag was right. She said, there's no luck in writing. I don't know about you, Professor Kim, but I have never written a good sentence by accident.
Right, exactly.
It comes with a lot of maybes and doubts. But in photography, your gut says, I want this. I want to say yes to this. I want to say yes to the world. And then the camera says yes unanimously. And then in the dark room, it comes out, and then you said, there's the magic. I didn't see that, right? Just like in the photo of myself in the refugee camp, the shirt, if you zoom in on the t-shirt, it says, I love Daddy. Of course,
yeah.
bought by my father. And yet it's the women who have created and orchestrated the preservation of that image, right? And so that subversiveness is so beautiful in that the information is gathered all at once.
I love that, the distinction, yes, maybes. And this idea of yes, we talked about this before, raises to me as an artist, as a Korean American scholar and poet, like also the question of coherence, right? Um, Oftentimes, I write across different registers and genres and disciplines and fields, and in many ways, I struggled to kind of write myself into existence. Maybe due to like a lack of visible precedents or like a fear of erasure and legibility. Um, and I think that what is coherence in art? What is coherence of the object, of the photo, of the poem? Um, it's something that shapes and I think obstructs many of us. And I just wanted to hear more about what you think of in terms of the completion of a work or what coherence even means related to
Oh, wow,
art.
that's beautiful. Well, it's interesting because I didn't know coherence was so valued until
Right?
I entered the professional world, right? You have to render yourself transparent in order to be valuable, in order to get a job, in order to have a publisher want something, right? Because when I was growing up, I was surrounded by storytelling that was full of mystery. And in fact, opacity was what was so enriching. Every time my grandmother told a story, it changed, right? And and I think I do agree. You know, Harold Bloom, the late critic, gets a lot of flack, and rightfully so. Um, but he, in his book defending the Western canon, you know, it's called The Western Canon. Um, he, he posits a series of rubrics for great literature. And a lot of it is, you know, conservative, you know, sort of backpedaling, rear guard thinking. But one element I do agree with, and I think he is right. And I actually think I credit him because you wouldn't think he would say this, given, you know, he's so leaning towards establishment canonical work. But he says the most important part of art that endures is strangeness. And I thought that's absolutely right, right? And I think there's something that in all of the, you know, the work that provokes us, that it means that we return to it again and again, and it's inexhaustible. There's a strangeness that doesn't reveal itself, that doesn't make it itself too explicit. And then it becomes something that goes beyond capital and commerce. You know, a bag of chips is exhaustible, but a work full of strangeness, interventions, stutters, and fragments could be revisited again and again. And I think I've aligned with that greatly. And I think it's because of I was raised by women who didn't read. They didn't tell me I had to make myself legible. There's a lot to be said about, you know, tiger moms in the Asian American cliches and upward mobility, but I didn't have that. You know, because of the war in Vietnam created the bad refugees, the bad immigrants, those who didn't have professional stakes. They weren't already professionalized. They didn't have money and land, right? As American policy prior, they were farmers, which was my family were. They were all farmers. So I was very blessed. And they said, look, son, worst case, you can work at McDonald's as a manager, you get a salary, you get health care, that's good enough. So for me, I had total freedom to be experimental but meaningful in my experiment, and not just to do something new for the sake of novelty. It had to have roots and substance. And I think the lack of coherence is a powerful disobedience, especially for an Asian American subject, which has been legible in this country mostly through labor. Right? Even the Chinese railroad workers, they weren't allowed to be buried if they died. They weren't allowed to be buried here. Their bones were shipped back to China, so that the physical evidence of their labor must be literally washed away. And also the idea of the Asian American art prodigy, right? It's legible usually as a music prodigy.
Exactly.
You can be a tool to play the cello, you know, as written by Bach or Beethoven, but to then have your own thoughts, have your own art, it's much more difficult. And so I think having lack of coherence and legibility to a certain point is really, really beautiful.
Thank you for that. And I love how you're bringing up this more capacious idea of Asian Americans, those from marginalized communities, because yes, we have all. There are good ones, bad Asians, rebellious ones, and what your photos are doing, they're also showing, for me as an Asian American, what it means to be photographed away from this spectacularized narrative of like grief and violence or utility, right? Human as object or human as function. Um, I I was reading Jennifer C. Nash's How We Write Now, Living with Black Feminist Theory, and she's thinking of a desire to think of the place of the ordinary in Black life. And you're doing so much of the ordinary, right? She wants to center in a Black feminist effort the quotidian, the banal, the blearily ordinary to Black people who still live as symbols of so much, whether pain or deviance, trauma or excess. And in a similar vein, I feel that many of your photos and also the scenes and the images and the characters and your writing, they center a part of us that have not been deemed legible or worthy of aesthetic interest. Um, and I wanted to know more, can you say more about your artistic practice in terms of, I guess, ordinariness and also the sense of working against this idea of also just in the service of labor or the reproduction of this capitalist productivity model of success?
Oh, what a beautifully researched question.
I'm a
Okay,
nerd.
Professor. Yes, please.
Stop it.
Somebody's about to get tenure. Thank you for that. And I think it extends, it extends along all roots of this country because this country is founded, I think, on labor, love, and loss. And that function crosses all ethnicities. The Irish white working class, the sharecroppers, the enslaved bodies stolen from their homes to build parts of this land. And then Asian American labor in the semiotic symbols, right? Nail salon workers, cooks, people in the back doors,
Dry cleaners.
nurses, dry cleaners, right? That was made possible by policy, right? In the 19th century, American policymakers did not want Asian American men doing masculine jobs, right? Like build the country, so they relegated them to service jobs, and that has really stuck. And so, to me, the most radical image of an Asian American is an Asian American at rest, right? An Asian American body doing nothing but exist, right? Standing in a river, bathing itself, holding and feeding a child. These moments I'm deeply interested in because it's also the moment where the body is tending to itself, right? So staticness, rest becomes agency, which the American commercial ethos tells us that's not true, right? Publish or perish. If you're not moving, you're lazy, right? I used to work in service work at a place called Panera. I don't know if y'all have it here.
Oh, we love
You have
Panera.
Panera?
We know Panera.
If you love it, yeah, I'll refrain from some elucidating. But when I worked there, my coworkers and I, we were so good at our jobs that we did our job. But when the manager came by, we had to pretend to labor. We performed labor. We moved towels from here to here, and then brought them back here so that we wouldn't get yelled at, right? And so there's a kind of shame in being still. There's a shame in rest, and I think it's no wonder that our young people are burning out, right? And I think my students are burning out. And so the body at rest becomes hyper-politicized because it becomes the first moment of resistance. And the cycles of that happens throughout this country, even in the American Renaissance, with the industrialization of the states. And right, when Whitman said, "I am free to lay and loaf," right, at a time where it was all about building tycoons, is for Whitman to say, I I celebrate the bathers, the people who are bathing themselves, the men, the laborers. That was it's still a radical tradition. And it's interesting you bring up, it's important that you bring up the Black tradition too, because I think of Carrie Mae Weems' Kitchen Table series and Gwendolyn Brooks's, Bronzeville, right? That first poem, The Onion Eaters, right? The Bean Eaters, and the first thing you smell in that poem is the sizzling onions of the Chicago, right, working class apartments, shared apartments. The food, how bodies are fed, right? It takes poetry from the Shakespearean sort of pedestal, which, by the way, Shakespeare didn't even put himself on. It was the propaganda that came after that put him on this canonical work. But Shakespeare was working with people, right? Everyday people. So it's interesting too that canonization and reification happens long after the working class lives of artists. But Brooks' work is so important to me. And the Black radical tradition, I think as an Asian American, is really important to me because in literature, in photography, and art, it was those writers, when we think about opposition to power, opposition to state, right? It was the Black thinkers that were the precursors that opened this river so that when you and I write about writing truth to power, we're working in the river brought forth by Phyllis Wheatley, a poet writing as an enslaved woman in Massachusetts to the threat of her life. Jupiter Hammond, a former, a slave, writing in Hartford, Connecticut. And this is 70 years before Whitman and Dickinson. And I tell my students this, I say, this too is the American tradition.
Exactly.
Just because it's not in the big Norton anthology of American verse, it's still the American tradition. And we, all people of all creeds and color, can be inspired by that, right? That we can see that and say, if those people, came first and made such radical decisions against power, then we can also contribute in that. They started it and we're in the shadow, we're living in the shadow. And to me, all Asian American writers working against power, critiquing power in their work, what is the state, how capacious and limiting is the state, owes to the Black tradition that started this great, great movement that we are all benefiting under.
Thank you for that. So much to think about. I'm also just reverberating sadness as agency, like that needs to go on to use it. It's it makes me think also of like just the very larger systems by which we conceive of like systems of valuation and judgment, right? That also undergird conceptions of art and what is considered beautiful, right? And you to me are like the epitome of an artist who creates beautiful, the gorgeous, right? This fleeting nature of art and its transientness. And you just are kind of with the way in which you're moving through genres now, it's really a tour de force. I'm reading again. I was reading the Alchemy lecture, the 5 Manifestos for a Beautiful World, and Christina Sharp, she contends that the beautiful world is not a touristic world of consumption and extraction, so what we've been talking about, but one that meets Dion Brand's understanding of beauty, beauty that is, quote, not uncomplicated. Beauty is the ability to see everything, to confront everything. And how do you define beauty and then apply it to your work?
Oh, that's such a beautiful question. And what a lovely, lovely concept. Beauty as a defiance, as a way to see. I mean, the camera in a way does that. It sees everything. It doesn't miss, right? But it also works with obfuscation. It blurs the shallow depth of field, right? Renders the background. And so choices are made. I'm always interested in how beauty has trafficked in the West as evidence of wealth and power. Like the still life began with agrarian wealth, right? Here, this is how much meat I can afford. This is how much meat I can leave out and let it rot because I have more coming, right? So that the tables of fruit, the outsize farm animals, right? It's a kind of evidence, which is why these were commissioned. It was kind of bragging rights, right? And so beauty was what was rare and powerful and acquired. And in the case of the Hudson School of Painting, you know, it was used to entice settlers further west. Look how open it is. It's ready for you, right? You wouldn't know that there were entire nations of indigenous folks living in these lands, looking at those beautiful, you know, seductive paintings. Um, but I think I have to go back to, you know, my grandmother and my mother, the women who raised me. They taught me how to see. You know, I became an artist, but they were, to me, were the first artists because they taught me how to see. And to them, beauty was always medicinal, right? It has this kind of like, if it's beautiful, you deserve more of it. And again, where does that come from, right? Here are women who are uneducated, illiterate, and I'm always interested in where does that power of recognition comes from outside of systems of education or power, right? Here they are, refugees. They could have said anything, but they sat me down and said, they showed me what is beautiful. You know, we would go up and look at a sunset, and my mother would say, "It's so beautiful and so sad." Again, that word sad, that's capacious. It holds beauty as well. So I was taught to see by women who knew so much loss and pain. And beauty for them was not decorous. It had a function in mundane, ordinary life. Beauty was ordinary. It was the biggest refrain in my household, being raised by these women, was the word đẹp quá, which is too beautiful, right? They would look at a hummingbird and say, too beautiful, right? That was the refrain of my life, right? They would make a perfect, you know, bowl of bún riêu or pho, and say, too beautiful, too beautiful. And that became my education. It's like, you know, when I started to write, I told myself I never have to turn away. I chose this art. It's my job to look deeper and see the beauty even inside the horror. The starfish, you amputate it and it starts to grow back its limbs. That's not a decorous beauty, it's not an aesthetic beauty, but conceptually it is so beautiful, right? The clam, you know, you making a pearl out of a grain of sand, agitating it, right? So to me, beauty is beyond the visual. It is also what's meaningful, what is conceptually true, and it's also the attempt. I think I want to respect the attempt as something legitimate, the process as the project. You know, I shy away from presenting something with such a strong, cohesive facade. And so in my writing, the paragraphs break apart, the chapter purposefully dissolve, right? Poetry is a form that breaks itself, the line break. It's an open joint, right? There's a violence that happens. You break the line in order to finish the poem. And I want to apply that structure and thinking to the rest of what I do.
That's really helpful just to think about beauty also just not visually and thinking also through, I guess, this emotional intimacy. I've struggled, you know, thinking about, in many ways, isn't the beautiful also as humans, but also in terms of art, it's an ethical commitment, right? So much of your writing also is thinking towards a different future, right? I'm thinking of like Jose Esteban Munoz and Joshua Chambers Letson's work on like the commons and the incommensurability of the commons. Like, how do we remain indifference from each other, but still build a sociality or a world of common ground? One that doesn't buy into the homogenizing desires of whiteness, right? So it's really, I guess, affirming to me as a writer and a scholar to see your version and your vision of beauty that is also really intensely personal, right, and familial. It makes me think of the role of memory and time across your works, both personal and then like collective. what role does memory and then how play in your work, and then how does then that fuse with the really cool stuff you're doing, temporality, right? Because you're not thinking chronologically, chrononormatively, and you're thinking in the beautiful photos out there, like you say, like a time accordion.
Oh, well, memory is it's an interesting thing because, the scientists tell us that we make it every time we remember, we make. So remember is to attach as opposed to dismember, right? We're making new neurons in our brain every time. So it's fallible, but it's a work of creation. But it's also incredibly costly to remember, to think of a day in your past, to think of a time when you were 12 or even just last year. If you do that, you daydream that, you displace the present. So the cost of memory is literally your life. It's your current moment in your life gone. You're not present here because you're there, right? And so it's like choose wisely what you remember. And I was raised by women who often chose not to remember. It was too painful. And so to me, I do feel as a 1.5 generation immigrant that sometimes I achieve their dreams for me by betraying their visions. They don't want me to. They said, why are you looking at pain? Why are you looking at photographs of Vietnamese people so mangled as corpses? It's even hard to discern one body from another. And, I don't have an answer for them. But all I say is that I chose this because of curiosity. And I think memory, wonder is also something that we don't often talk about, right? I like that, to me, there's a curiosity, there's a wonder. And in my own work, I never know what I'm going to write. I have a kind of North Star that I move towards. And most of the time, I'm just digging. And once in a while, you see a white flash, and then you keep digging, you realize it's a bone, God knows to what. But you keep going, and you reveal things to yourself as a writer. But it helps me start to think about how I can stop writing, oddly enough. One of my heroes is Annie Dillard. And when I was 22, I came home one day from school at Brooklyn College, and she was on the radio. And I was undressing, and I just stopped. I said, Annie Dillard's talking, There must be a new book, hallelujah. And she quickly said to the host, I'm here to announce that I'm done. And interestingly enough, the host immediately kind of says, well, in a polite way, do you have dementia, right? Is something wrong? It's interesting that, again, for a woman, an artist, to put so much, I think the first woman, I believe, to win the Pulitzer in nonfiction, to say, I want to rest and I'm satisfied, immediately feels like error, right? Something must have happened for you to stop. And Dillard, to her credit, says, no. One day I got to my desk and I realized I've said everything I wanted to say just the way I said it. And we're told as writers and artists that we should build this body of work, that the satisfaction of being an artist is to look at your bibliography and say, look, I keep coming and coming and coming. But I was very fortunate at 22 to have a different model there. Because I said, gosh, what if instead of just endlessly making, my goal as a writer is to write so carefully and with such intention that I too can one day get to my desk and said, I did it on my terms, and now I can live with the capacity of looking that the books afforded me, the sharpening of the gaze that the books so naturally have afforded me. And I can look at the world with that mind and clarity without having to turn it into a product. Isn't that the ultimate reward, is to see better, right? And it just flipped how I thought. And I thought, oh, the byproduct of writing a book are the books. The main destination, the ultimate telos, is how to really look at this world alongside the people living in it. And it changed, and I hope I'm lucky enough to get to where Dillard got to, the sooner the better. To be able to say, to make my work finite and say, I've done what I wanted to do, but I'm not done, I'm not over, I'm not thrown away because, or something's not wrong with me just because I decided to stop. I ache for that, and that's my goal as an artist, to learn how to stop well.
Yes. It's incredible. Yes, not just non-compliance, but in many ways the rebellious feeling of just stopping, right? It seems like an act of rebellion or some kind of denial of self. I have one more question, then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. You think about the gaze. In On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, you write.
I always think about the gaze.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had to.
Love that. And it's like one of my favorite novels. You write, quote, "In a world myriad as ours, the gaze is a singular act. To look at something is to fill your whole life with it, if only briefly." It reminds me of I wanted to bring it back to your photography. It reminds me of the etymology of the word photograph. So phos, Greek, means light. Graphe from Greek is writing or drawing. So together, a photograph means writing or drawing with light. And it's just such, to me, a beautiful evocation of your practice. And how do you interpret this idea then in your current role of writing and drawing with light? And I was wondering if you could just speak more to that.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, I tell my students, I remind them this, that looking is a civic duty. And seeing too. Some of us don't have eyes to look, but there are still ways of entangling ourselves towards the vision of the world. And we owe it to ourselves, our world. But as artists, this is where we plant our flag of work. I need to look. And I think even looking without making is incredibly productive because there are different definitions of work. And sometimes seeing is not always knowing, which is why photos, poems, right? There's poems I read years ago, I revisit them now, having lost a mother, having my brother, we are 10 years apart, move in with me, being now 35. I see more in the words of writers like Dickinson, Toni Morrison, Ginsberg, Kerouac. It's interesting, I always written off Kerouac as this. It's always the fans of Kerouac ruined him for me, right?
Yeah, I know.
But I started to...
I abandoned him.
But I started to revisit Kerouac because he's a New England writer. He's coming from Lowell. And I revisited his first novel, The Town and the City. And it's actually so close to what I'm trying to do. There's such tenderness there. And again, it brings me this idea that, we have to keep looking at the present and the archive because the living are outnumbered by the dead. We have to do this huge work of salvaging meaning from the past and then forging new meaning towards the future. And when I look back at Kerouac's work, I said, oh my goodness, they didn't see this. They misconstrued him because they didn't see all of this, right? This kind of deep sadness, this deep compassion for the brokenness. This is before On the Road, where a lot of the misogyny came in, right? The bravado, the performance. He was so earnestly Catholic in trying to find goodness in the community. And there was just such wonder and whimsy in that work, and it related a lot to, I saw myself, right? Lo and behold, looking at this white man writing about his life in 1940, New England, I started to see echoes of myself. And Toni Morrison says this. She says, I read Tolstoy and I see myself. I get to do that, right? I don't care who they are. Maybe they never imagined a black woman in Ohio reading me, reading their work. But because that happened, I have access to that in my imagination. That's my agency, and I get to claim that experience too. That's the beauty of writing. The beauty of art is that ultimately it has no value inherently. We, the living, have to curate and orchestrate value around it with discourse. Unlike water and food, right? You can just point to that and say, that's valuable. We all know that. But it's harder to look at a book or a painting and say, why did we put this one here as a something else? And on one hand, it's very daunting. On another hand, it's so inspiring because that's what gets people in the room. We come together and we, the living, outnumbered by the dead, has to now make a decision about value in ways that has no inherent value. And we do that through language. This feeble, reductive, finite material that now we're using, this kind of broken material that we're now using towards expansion and clarity. It seems almost too impossible, too fantastical to be possible, and yet historically it has always been possible and a great privilege to participate in.
Wow. Yeah. And as someone who has come to literature through, we talked about this about when I first encountered, when I wanted to become an English major, I was sitting down in front of a Norton anthology and I was reading, I believe, one of the Romantics, John Keats or Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and this person, long dead, no overlap with my life in whatsoever fashion, spoke to me. And I think that is in many ways, also the community around which I am sustained by these dead writers, right? By these dead artists, and so much of, I think, us as living professors and artists, I feel like it's kind of like my mission to also continue on that legacy in a way. It's in many ways a kind of spiritual practice, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I'm gonna turn it over to a couple of questions from the audience.
Okay.
Someone wants to know, can you talk about the challenges that arise in helping your audience pivot with you from poetry to photography? I'm an artist bringing writing into my work and find it challenging.
Yeah. I don't know. I might have an extreme, a more extreme view of this. And I think the greatest respect you can give a reader or a viewer is to ignore them. And I mean that earnestly. I think because when you start to fantasize about an ideal reader, immediately you start to build a kind of scarecrow out of preconceptions, ideas of what you think a reader wants from you, what an ideal reader is, right? And so you create a kind of straw person out of this fantasy, and it has no relation to reality. And I've been fortunate enough to be in so many rooms across the world because of my work, and every room I'm in, there's different people, just like this room. Like, who am I to sit down and say, let me just erase all of you and pick one, right? And then what does that mean too, right? It's not even just this kind of ethical, moral position, but it's an artistically impossible one. Because if I then say, well, maybe my audience wants me to really showcase these identitarian markers, gay, the Asian American, what have you. But then those are too large and abstract to hold me, right? And then now I'm actually removing portions of myself to make myself more recognizably palatable to those audiences. And then now I've actually amputated more of myself away. So in that attempt to reach an audience, I've actually left myself behind. And I think the most valuable thing about art is that we get to a space so specific, it actually becomes universal. Right? When Brooks wrote about the smell of onions in the cramped Chicago flats, like, I've never been there, but there's a kind of verisimilitude to that lived life. I start to trust that she's out ahead. She's not looking at me, right? I think for me, there's two types of, very broadly speaking, there's two types of writers. And you know it when you start reading their books. There's the book where you read it and you feel like the writer's like in an interview suit behind a table, selling you on this book while you're reading it, right? Here's exactly what you thought you wanted. And I don't know about y'all, but for me, I start to kind of get queasy. I start turning away from that book, right? I'm more interested in the other phenomena where I encounter like the back of a writer's head. And I realize I come closer to the back of her head, and I see sweat in the back of her neck. And I realize, oh my goodness, she's digging. She's digging a hole. And I get to look over her shoulder. And there's a kind of absolute disregard for me. And there's a kind of voracious questing of this work. And she's just digging, and I'm just like precarious looking over. And then we're both collectively venturing. And when you can feel when a writer and an artist is just really venturing and inviting you along the linear technology of the sentence, there's a great trust. It's a spiritual trust, and you say, oh, you're not trying to win me over. You're really out there trying to figure something out, and because that's what I want out of my literature. I want someone who really out there asking the questions they don't have the answers for, and I'm privileged enough to be on the ride.
I love that image of just watching over their shoulder and a writer that is writing with a mission that is delinked from the audience, right? And this extractive, consumptive nature of that exchange, writing for a public and a certain kind of people pleasing.
Can I just say, because I'm here, when I was selling my book, I was meeting with publishers, and I was fortunate. Sometimes you don't get to meet with publishers, and I saw them raise their concerns, and one of them said, I'm writing about New England. I'm writing about explicit, fumbling, coming of age, sex and intimacy, boys. This white boy, this Asian boy, trying to find their way without the language of queerness, without role models, without elders teaching them how to find pleasure. So it's just what's inside them. It's just desire leading them out, and they're fumbling, and it's messy. And one of the publishers says, well, what about the Midwestern audience? It's too much for them, right? And this was years ago. I've never been to the Midwest, but I knew enough to say, I don't know. I think they have nervous systems and brains and inner lives and sexual pleasures. God forbid they feel things. But it was a wild education to come to New York as a rural person and realize and see the limitations of this coastal way of building art and power, right? Because Penguin Random House is powerful, right? And here I am, being asked to make to render to a preconceived and falsely conceived limitation of a huge portion of the country.
Exactly.
And they work like this every day. And I was so lucky that I was already a scholar, a professor at that time. I published a book of poems. So I knew enough to say that you're being silly, with all due respect. But how many young writers folded at that moment? How many young artists have gone into that room and left erasing their work because of this scarecrow idea of a reader somewhere in the Midwest that won't understand them, right? But it happens at all levels. And again, that disobedience even sometimes starts in those business meetings way before you get to the final draft of the novel.
And thank you for bringing your art to the Midwest.
Thank you.
Seriously, thank you. Like, okay, we have time for one more question. I thought this would be a good ending one, especially for me because it is healing. What is your art's relationship to healing and/or liberation?
Well, it would be good if healing occurs in the way that it would be good if healing occurs anywhere, including stamp collecting, coloring, interpretive dance. So I'm not against healing, but I do resist the presumption that my writing will heal. I think I can't write from that position because it assumes that I know more than the reader. And I don't work well as an artist when I have a seemingly superior position than a reader. To me, the goal is not to heal because I don't know what healing is, and I don't know. Here's something interesting. I don't know if I want to heal. I'm more interested because healing is there's an end to it, right? The lifespan of the experience is over. You know, I'm an advocate for bodily health, healing, mental health, of course, but as a larger concept, to me, I think the figuring out together, right? And maybe I would say healing up to 90% is much more fruitful because it leaves room for all of us who are not there, right? Because it could be very lonely to say, well, I'm healed, good luck to you, you know, because I've heard that myself. And I said, I don't know if that's where we're most useful to each other, right? I think there's always something to work towards. And I hope that my work is provocative. And if a reader gets more of themselves reading my work, that's all I can ask for. I'm never the kind of artist that would say to someone, you got it wrong. I didn't mean that. You totally got it wrong. There's no, the way language works, right? There's no way for me to correctly, fully say that to anybody. And so to me, I built an experience. You embody it if you choose to. And what you feel from that, whether it's healing, whether it's confirmation, confusion, befuddlement, bewilderment, joy, it's still true. It's still yours. And our reception to the world is sometimes the only thing we have. People can take everything away from us, but other than how we feel with the world. And I think I do respect that immensely. And I would never stand behind my work and say, this should heal you. But if it happens, I'm all for it. But I just can't sit down, you know, I don't know, I can't speak for other artists, but I can't sit down at the desk and say, man, they're really gonna feel better because of this, right? Because to be honest,
Right.
that's how the dictators start,
Exactly.
right? I mean, all the fascists at one point, right? Early on, were like, this is good for them. And we'll feed it to them with force and military power, right? So I like to just shy away from that towards a kind of more open and perhaps complicated method.
What about liberation?
The work of liberation, I think, especially in the arts, this I have a different answer on. It's already possible, right? And my students often ask this, and thank you for following up on that. My students, rightfully so, are saying, what do we do? There's 2 wars that we know of.
Right.
There's people dying, genocide, loss of life. There's fascists rising all across the world. What's the point of a poem, Professor?
Right.
And they're virtuous to ask that, and they're right to ask that. And it's my job to remind them that, you know, there's room enough for all of the work to help liberate each other and fight for each other through legislation and activism, and write the poem with consciousness and care. There's enough hours in the day. You don't have to do all of that in one day, but there's enough. And historically, those work coincide. And I teach Aimé Césaire's Notebook to Return of Native Land. You know, here's a poet who became a politician of Martinique, who wrote a poem, a long poem, and that poem is very informative because it's about the French, crimes, national crimes against the Martinician people in slavery. And he ends that poem with a scene in the revolt of a slave ship that happened in the past. And what Césaire is telling us is that this is not the act of liberation is not the hill, the city on the hill that we're moving towards. It's already happened. In multiple microcosms, we've already successfully fought for each other, with legislation and poems and art, right? And it's interesting, it's also a specifically Western privilege idea to question the power of art when so many folks outside of this country, across the globe, inherently and innately use art alongside fighting for liberation and expanding for people's rights. It's not even a question. You go to activist movements in Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Brazil, and the poems are just there. They're not questioned, right? And so I also remind my students that there is a kind of privilege for us to sit in an institution like NYU, where I teach, and question the validity and the utility of something that folks in the third world are using at this moment to fight for their lives, right? And it's important to honor that tradition has already occurred. Going from the songs that enslaved people in this country used to direct folks towards freedom in the North, and how those songs moved to the oral tradition. The poems were already working alongside liberating fronts. And there is a kind of elitism for us to sit here after that great wealth of progress and say, well, can it do anything else, right?
Right.
And I think it's important to reframe it that. And also, why don't we ever ask sculpture or dance if it will
Exactly.
save the world, right?
Right.
Or orchestral music, right? It's interesting that poetry is often the one that we single out and say, well, are you saving the world or not? Because otherwise, we're going to throw you into the dump, right? But so it's interesting that this minor art, in many
Right.
ways, that doesn't always make a lot of money, but it's also an art that's very accessible to the working class in the oral tradition, and music is the one that those in power are often most skeptical of, right? Every 6 or so years, there's somebody in the New Yorker or the Atlantic who writes this kind of bombastic article saying, is poetry really important, or can we do away with it by now, right? And it's interesting that they've ignored the function of it happening nowadays, and particularly with music and young folks. People ask me, where's the next Rimbaud, right? Rimbaud, this revolutionary writer in the 19th century France. That's like, the next Rimbaud is probably not a poet, most likely a hip hop artist or a musician,
Yeah.
right? Working with their time, making SoundCloud, mixtapes in their bedroom, putting the language to use in ways that is shareable with those in their community, right? Working for your community is, to me, the tantamount. And if your art goes beyond that, that's just the whipped cream after that. But to me, the ultimate testament for me is that how is these photographs functioning in my community? And if anyone in my community says to me, I don't like that photo, I would never show it. I don't like how I'm seen in that, I would never show it. To me, it's always a collaborative. My brother works with me with every shot. I give him suggestions, but everything that ends up how it is how he wants to be seen. And that work is very, very important to me.
Thank you so much, Ocean. Oh, you can go see his photos in Gallery 35 over there. And for the book signing, will be in center court at 3:30.
And I'm not sure, can I use this? Yeah. I forgot to say one thing is that this, as you know, this lecture is being recorded. So if you enjoyed it, you can share it with your friends. And also on our website is a beautifully edited digital version of Ocean's, it's a digital publication of his photography. So please enjoy that on the website. Enjoy the book signing, and thank you so much, Ocean and Joey.